Watercolor effects. Create a new document in Photoshop using the web large. I'm going to move the instructions over here so that you guys can focus on Photoshop here. But I'll be reading the instructions on my other screen. Create a new document in Photoshop using the web large 1920 by 1080 pixel preset. So if you go to File, New, you can use the web presets, go to the web presets, and then find web large is the one that we're looking for. It's 1920 by 1080 at 72 ppi. Remember, 72 ppi is sufficient for anything that's going to be displayed on a screen and not printed out. Next step says embed the practice image into the new image that you created. Again, it doesn't explain what embedding is. At this point, we've embedded things many times, so you should know how to do it. But if you don't, then you can follow the video, I guess. You're gonna go to File and then Place Embedded, and I'm gonna find the image that I'm using. File, Place, and then it says to transform and resize it to fit. Now, when you first embed an image, it automatically has you transforming it. I guess it assumes that you're going to need to, so it starts you off there. So I'm going to place it. I want to make sure that my portrait, the person, that's the important thing here. In your case, it's going to be Robert Downey Jr., is going to be filling up vertically, filling up the canvas as much as you can. So I'm going to resize it. If you're using the 2018 version of Photoshop, which is most of you in the room, when you resize it, you need to hold Shift and drag from a corner. If you don't do that, he's going to either look smashed vertically or he's going to look smashed horizontally. He's going to be distorted. You don't want it to be distorted. It boggles my mind that students don't notice when the portrait gets distorted. But it's so apparent to me. Maybe it's just my jaded teacher senses. I don't know. But I'm going to expand this. It's okay that some of my picture is outside of the canvas. I don't care about that part of the picture. I only care about the portrait part of the picture. So I'm going to expand it until it fills it up vertically like that. And then I'm going to confirm my transformation by clicking on the check mark at the top. So again, be careful not to distort the dimensions there. Number 3, step 3 says to desaturate the image. That means make it black and white. I'm going to use my image adjustments menu and go to black and white. And I know that because this is the only layer I have on there, I don't have to worry about which layer I have selected. I'm going to just use the default values. You're welcome to play with the sliders here if you want to. And hit OK. And it desaturates it. So again, desaturate means take out all the color. And then it says to adjust your brightness and contrast to blow out, quote unquote, blow out or overexpose the image, which means to make it really bright. So again, I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, and then Brightness and Contrast. And I'm going to turn the brightness up pretty high here until I start to lose detail in the areas that were already a little bit brighter. So they just turn pure white. You could play with contrast a little too. I don't think you really need to at this point. I'm going to hit OK. And then move on. Enter alert. Okay, then it says, with a selection tool of your choice, select, you're going to be selecting Mr. Robert Downey Jr. to quickly select, using whatever selection tool, select Mr. Robert Downey Jr., period, end of sentence. All right, so I like to use the quick select tool. You can use whichever tool you prefer, but whatever the tool is, generally the tool is going to be sufficient to, oops. It's going to be sufficient to get a rough selection of your portrait, maybe not a really detailed one. Like this. It does okay around the hair, doesn't do great. This is a difficult photo anyway because there's a lot going on in the background which interrupts it. I'm going to just move over really quickly and open up that Robert Downey Jr. and show you a trick here. Because one thing that you guys are going to run into with that specific picture is the hair. And this is something that I haven't shown you guys before as far as selections go, and how to select something complex like hair or fur or some kind of texture along the outside without having to go in and, like manually use the lasso tool to get it. There it is, watercolor practice. All right, so in this case, if I was to use the quick select tool to select Robert Downey Jr. really fast, And I didn't do the desaturation and all that stuff. I'm just focusing on showing you this selection process at the moment. So I get a good rough selection using my quick select tool here. It's not perfect, and that's okay, but especially around the hair, you can see that unless I go in with the lasso tool, I can't get the hair perfectly. And even with the lasso tool, it would take me forever to do that manually. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the top in my options bar. You should see a select and mask button. I'm going to click on that, and it takes me into a whole new interface. I have new tools on the left side. I have a new panel on the right side. And you can see that it shows me where my mask would be, or what I have selected right now. What I have selected is the stuff that is naturally colored. Your view may be a little bit different. I don't think I've shown you guys the select and mask interface yet, but in case I haven't, my preference in this interface, what I think is the most helpful view is when you go to view over here, use the overlay view. And I like red. And again, it's probably, you can change the color if you want to whatever. Color indicates, the stuff that's not selected. I prefer red, so I'm going to leave it red there. Anyway, you can see that around the hair, when I zoom in here, there are a lot of areas of white, and those areas of white are currently, within my selection, and there are areas of the hair that aren't selected, they're red. Now I have this really cool tool in the select and mask interface that is called the Refine Edge Brush tool. It's the second one down. It looks like a little brush, like with a comet in front of it or something. If I click on that, and I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, what it does is it magically selects areas of background and deselects areas of non-background. Like it somehow detects it, because Photoshop programmers are awesome and can do that. So all I have to do, I don't have to go in and trace over anything. All I have to do is click and drag around the edge of that hair, and you can see that it deselects all that white in the background all by itself, and it reselects the hair. You can see the hair is no longer red there along those edges. So it's really, really quick and really, really easy to get a really, really complex selection. And if you want to see a little bit better, you can see how well it did within that hair. So this is a really cool, really awesome tool to learn and to know and to use a lot, especially when you have these really complex selections. All right, so I could do something else. I'm just going to leave the output by itself as it is, but as a selection, that's the default, and I'm going to hit OK. And then I have that complex selection. And then the next step is to make a layer mask out of that, which you guys know is just the little layer mask button at the bottom there. And you can see that now I have that really well cut out hair with his awesome do. And it looks good. All right, but I'm going to go back to mine over here, because that's where I've made my progress already. Now, if your picture looks like this, and it might, especially when you're doing your own personal picture, like areas like this in the background might make it difficult to use this tool, but I'm going to try it anyway and see how well it does. It does okay. You see, it kind of selects a little bit of the shelf back there. It doesn't do the best job. So I'm going to leave it fairly detailed. The good thing about this particular technique is that it's not really going to depend on a lot of little tiny details like that, because in the end, you're not going to see, probably not going to see a whole lot of those individual hairs anyway. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to hit OK. I have my selection, and I'm going to make my layer mask with that selection. So you can see that it cuts everything out quickly. Yes. All right, next step. Mask it out, leaving only him visible. Step 5, duplicate the layer with your portrait on it. So I only have one layer so far. You might, if you're using the 2018 version, I'll stop to say this. You may not have the artboard here at the top. You'll just have your portrait layer and a blank layer, and that's okay. Either way, you want to duplicate the layer with your portrait on it. So I'm going to click on this layer. I'm going to hold right-click on the layer actually, and go to duplicate layer, and then hit OK. And so I have 2 copies of that layer now. Step 6, select the original portrait layer. That's down here, the bottom one. And click on Image Adjustments Threshold. So I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, and Threshold. You're not going to see anything happen on the canvas, but if you look in your Layers panel down here, you will see that it turns the image black and white on that layer. So I'm going to hit OK. And it's because this layer up here is blocking it, but if I was to turn it off, you can see the effect of the threshold. Essentially, it turns your image black and white. And if you need to, you can adjust the value a little bit. The higher the threshold, the more detail you'll see. The lower it is, the less detail you'll get. So kind of adjust it. In the end, the threshold is going to determine where the watercolor is going to be visible, where that effect is going to be visible. So the more you have, the more it's going to be visible. Adjust it to where you like it, and then hit OK. And the next steps, oh, I have 2 step 6s. That's supposed to be step 7. Sorry. Select the duplicated layer, top one in the layers panel, and use the filter gallery to apply a watercolor filter. This one's fairly simple. So I'm going to turn that layer back on, select it, filter. You guys have used the filter gallery before. And my watercolor filter is down here under the artistic brushes, or the artistic filters here. One thing to be aware of that might trip you guys up, depending on what filters you have applied before, you may have multiple filters applied by default already. If you've applied filters before, they stick in there. So if you need to, if you have like 2 or 3 or 10 or 20 different filters in this list right here, you'll need to delete those filters. So if I was to, I don't know, if I had multiple filters here, you have multiple ones in the list, make sure that you delete it so that you only have one filter. So you can see, you know, a true version of the watercolor effect. You can play around with the settings if you like. I'm going to leave it as you see it here and hit OK for the sake of time and brevity, such as it is. Step 8, set the blending mode of the duplicated layer to multiply. That's my duplicated layer, is the one on top. I'm going to set my blending mode to multiply there. And what that does is it blends it down with this layer here. Next, you should have 2 layers, the merge layer, the portrait layer, white background layer beneath it. You won't have a white background layer if you're using a newer version of Photoshop. The older version, you'll probably have that white background layer. Don't worry about it if you don't. Step 9, create a new transparent layer. I'm going to click on my new layer button. Makes a new transparent layer. Remember the checkerboard pattern there indicates a transparent layer. And then step 10, download the following image, then in Photoshop, file, open, and open it in a new window. Okay, so there's an image on the assignment page. It's like a splash of watercolor. I already downloaded it. Right-click and download it. And go to File, Open. Don't embed it. Open it in a new window. I don't remember what I called it. Or where? Maybe I put it on my desktop. Let me see. There it is. Samples. Open. All right, so it opens into a new document here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that document tab and drag it down so that I can see the portrait that I was working on and this at the same time. I'm going to click back over and drag that and move it around. So now I can see both. I want to make sure I have my portrait layer selected, and I'm going to close my layers panel so I have more room. All right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the clone stamp tool, and I'm going to start to sample from this picture and then paint it over onto this picture over here. Not too hard. We've used the clone stamp tool before. Before you start with the clone stamp tool, though, I would recommend experimenting a little bit with some of the brushes that are available. My personal preference, you have some default brushes. I don't think that any of them are especially good. You have your default general brushes. Those are okay, but most of the other specialty brushes that come into Photoshop and in Photoshop by default, they have tools assigned to them, which means that if you look in the top right corner of each of these brushes, you'll see a brush icon or you'll see an eraser icon. It means if I like, even though I like that brush, if I click on it, it's going to switch to my eraser tool instead of the clone stamp tool. It's going to switch to the brush instead of the clone stamp tool. So those ones you can't really use. So instead, to get some interesting brushes, you can either download them, or if you click on the gear icon in the top right here, go to Legacy Brushes. When you click on that, you'll load a new folder. You may have done this before, because I know I've told you about it. You'll get a whole huge set of older brushes that used to be in Photoshop but aren't anymore for some reason. I like the thick, heavy brushes. You can again play around with whichever ones you like. I don't remember which one I used for the example before. Let's try this one. Why not? No, let's try this one. Rough Round. All right, and then it says If you choose a brush with a very distinct shape, play with the angle, size, maybe even opacity jitter in the brush options to lend variety. So what all of that means is in your brush options, your brush settings, that's over here, you have these things called shape dynamics. You have tons of different options here. And typically in a typical non-COVID-19 year, you would have learned all of this already in the drawing tablet unit. But since we didn't, I'll go over it really quickly. All of these settings essentially change your brush each time you click. So if I set a size jitter, it means that every time I click, the size of my brush is going to change. It's going to get larger and smaller, depending on the maximum that I set here, and then the minimum, which is set in here, minimum diameter, 20%. So it can go down from 20% of 385 pixels up to 385 pixels. So you can see each time I click, my brush size changes there. Same principle applies to most of these settings. Let's say jitter. So an angle jitter changes the angle. If it's a circle brush, your angle is probably not going to matter a whole lot. The roundness jitter, again, circle brush, roundness isn't going to help a whole lot. But some brushes are like rectangular or square or sort of organic looking. Those settings will make more of a difference in those cases. Anyway, once you're happy with your settings, or you want to try the settings at least, go ahead and make sure that you are on. Oh, I did all of that before I realized I wasn't on the clone stamp tool anymore. Let's go ahead and do that again. And then my brush settings, make sure at least size jitter. For this brush, I want size jitter on. Okay. So I have my clone stamp tool. I'm going to click inside of this window here. I'm going to hold the Alt key. Remember, the Alt key lets me sample. I get the little target. I'm going to click somewhere on my sample image, and then come back here. Come back here to the image I was working on before, and then I'm going to start to click, and that is going to take forever. I'm going to make this a lot larger. That's better. Okay, and I don't really like how it's covering. It's not covering very well. So maybe let's try this one. Ooh, that's huge. Rough round whistle. Again, play with it until you like the effect. That's good. We'll go with that. All right, so I'm going to sample. Again, we'll try this again. And start to click inside here. Now, you want to essentially cover all of those areas of black that are in your picture that are going to be showing up. Don't worry about not being able to see the portrait. That comes later. But cover it up. Also, as far as technique goes, sample multiple times. Don't just click and then click sample once and then drag across the whole thing. That's just creating a copy over it. But if I click and sample and then click and then go back and sample again and then come back and click, I can get more of a random pattern to it that way. And if you find you're getting a lot of white and you don't like that, then you may want to move your brush size down a little bit so you can control it a little better. All right, so do that. Cover up your picture with lots of different colors. And if you feel like you want to, use a different source instead of this watercolor splash that I gave you guys, you are welcome to find a different source of colors and texture. But essentially, that is what we're going for. Cover it up until you can't see the portrait anymore. And you can adjust this later if you don't like the effect in the end. It's not written in stone. We're going to go with that. There's a little bit left right there. Okay, I'm going to call that good for now. And move on to step 12. Once you're satisfied, set the paint layer's blending mode to multiply. I'm going to minimize that for now. I'm going to go to my layers, make sure I'm on my paint layer, and I'm going to set it to multiply here. So that's going to give me this overlay of the paint that I made over the portrait that I have. And don't worry, if you're not satisfied, this is not the end yet. You should end up with a background layer, portrait layer, and a painted layer. So we got those. Oh, I forgot to merge one down. I'm sorry. I did skip a step, I think. We were supposed to merge these two together. Let's merge those. There we go. Select the portrait layer, select all, and copy it. The portrait layer. So I'm going to select the portrait layer, press Control-A to select all. You can see my marching ants around the whole thing, and then copy it. Select the painted layer and create a layer mask. So select my painted layer, make a layer mask, and then Alt click on that layer mask. I'm going to Alt click on it. My canvas is going to turn white. I'm editing just the layer mask. All I can see here is the layer mask right now. And then it says to use edit, paste special, and paste in place. So edit, paste special, paste in place. It's Shift Control V is the shortcut. So I'm pasting that onto my, let me see if I can move it over here so you can see it, onto my layer mask. I'm pasting the portrait onto the layer mask. And then click off of the layer mask in the layers panel. So click anywhere outside of that in the layers panel. And you can see that it applies that to that. Turn off or delete the portrait layer. On the bottom, I'm going to turn off. So I'm going to have one single layer. And that's what I've ended up with. Did I miss something? Hold on. Select A, select painted layer. Canvas will turn white. I'm supposed to invert it somewhere. Ah, I missed the invert. I'm going to go back. I'm going to hold Shift, no, Alt, and click on that. I forgot to invert it. Image, adjustments, invert. There we go. And then click off of it. Now that's better. All right. Turn off or delete the portrait layer, blah, 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 blah. At this point, with the painted layer selected, either edit the mask or use the eraser tool on the paint itself to strategically remove some of the less important details. So if there's anything like the shirt, I don't need the shirt, or a lot of this stuff down here, the edge of the table, I could then go in with the eraser tool. With the eraser tool, I can also select, some specialized brushes. And click here, turn off my selection, and then I can go in and I can remove some of this a little bit creatively. And you can play around with it. And if you don't like, if there's areas that you find are missing, you can go back into onto this layer, and instead of using the eraser tool, you can use the clone stamp tool and go back to that watercolor sample and put a little bit more in until you can see all of the picture that you really want to see. Next step says do a search for a high-res texture of your choice to use as a background. So if I was to take over here, I suggest paper. I like using paper. So like a paper high-res texture. Don't use the same one I use, but that's really all you have to search for. Go to images. I like something crinkly. We'll just go with this. You may be blocked from a lot of these, fair warning. I don't know. Try it and see. I'm going to save the image as wrinkled paper texture. Go back into Photoshop. Oh, let's pull up the tutorial one more time. Make sure the paper is the top layer and adjust its size if need be to cover the entire image. So I'm going to File, I'm going to Place Embedded, find my paper texture, resize it to fit over the image. I didn't really find a good high-res one that matched my resolution, but that's okay for this one. It's okay that it goes off of the edge of the page. I'm going to click the check mark. Make sure the paper is the top layer, adjust its size if need be to cover the entire image. Apply linear burn blending mode to the paper layer. So linear burn, that's linear light, not linear burn, linear burn. There we go. Now it looks like watercolor on paper. Add and embellish as you please. I added his name on there, and I also, kind of use the same technique to watercolor the name. Once you finish with the practice image, save as a JPEG. Repeat the above process with a personal image of you, a family member, or a friend. Blah, 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 blah. All right, I'm going to stop the recording. Anybody have any questions? I know that was a lot. I know.